Welcome back to Anthropology 127, Introduction to Archaeological Sciences. This is the second part of the first lecture, so I'm going to go on talking more about archaeology, how it works, and also where it came from a little bit. So I'll share screen now and we'll keep on going. Okay, this is where we ended up last time. And we're looking about where you find archaeologists. So in North America and a few other places, archaeology is part of anthropology, as it is here at Hunter College, where it's part of the four fields. In many parts of the rest of the world, prehistoric archaeology often was its own department by itself, or it's paired with history or tied to a museum, which is a very old pattern. Classical archaeology usually is separate, sometimes part of the classics department, as at Hunter, or sometimes in our history department. Is archaeology science? We'll come back to that. It's a bit of a trick question, and it became more scientific with time. Okay, it's important to realize that most archaeologists actually work outside of academia. They're not all in colleges and universities. Major museums employ archaeologists, and as you'll see, that was the original home of professional archaeologists. National Park and Heritage agencies like U.S. National Park Service, Historic Scotland, these all employ lots of archaeologists. State agencies, departments of transportation, state heritage offices, and museums, lots of archaeologists working there. NGOs, non-governmental organizations like the Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, also employ archaeologists. Increasingly, indigenous organizations, U.S. tribes, Canadian First Nations, have their own archaeological staff. And contract companies, cultural resource management companies or CRM, who carry out environmental impact statements ahead of construction, employ lots of archaeologists. So about 67% of practicing archaeologists are not in academic departments. And be aware that for many of these folks, the MA is the working degree. So there's lots of archaeology you do without going to a doctoral program. Okay, let's think together now a bit about how archaeology works as a way of understanding the past. How is it different from history? So that's something to think about for a bit. History has been around for a much longer time than the discipline that archaeology has. Arguably, history is thousands of years old. People both Chinese histories, Greek histories, far back in the past. So archaeology is pretty recent, as we'll see, 150, 200 years maybe. So what is different about archaeology from history? What are the limitations of history compared to archaeology? So things to think about is, when does literacy start? If history makes use of written documents as this fundamental tool for understanding the past, the question is, when do you start getting these? And again, we're talking a few thousand years. How old is a human story? Millions of years old. So where does literacy start? Well, literacy begins, as far as we can tell, somewhere in Mesopotamia, spreads to Egypt. It is found in multiple parts of the Old World and the New. But most of the globe was not covered by history until quite recently. But the question is, who's literate? In a society where writing exists, how many people, what percentage of the population actually is producing literature, is capable of reading and writing? Tied to this is this question of who pays for it, who pays for writing things down. And once you ask that question, it kind of answers itself. People with money, people with resources, the elites. Famously, history is written by the winners, and the defeated people often do not have much history to talk about. So who gets left out? What do they pay attention to? Different documents have different value for historians. Some of them, there are things like lists of taxes, lists of things owed, are primary records, which can be quite useful in terms of trying to reconstruct the economy. Others, long religious texts, astronomical observations, there are different kinds of texts, and so it depends on what they were interested in. Okay, so thinking about archaeology then, as being something that focuses on material remains rather than documentary record of the historian, this question is sort of, what's the difference between what we do and what treasure hunters do? Treasure versus information. In this slide, you see a picture of a big pile of different kinds of silver ornaments of different kinds, mostly coming from Sweden from the Iron and Bronze Age. This is a cool picture, but the sad story is almost all of the objects you see here were collected before archaeology really got going as a discipline. So we're not really quite sure where they come from within Sweden. So that's getting into the issue of context. Where did it come from? Context recording is the key. Better context, more information. Lost context, lost value. So all of these objects you're just looking at would have much more value for us if they had little labels on them which told us where they came from, what layer, what site, at least what part of Sweden. In those cases, we don't have that information at all. So keeping context attached to finds is critical. Real archaeologists in the field spend an awful lot of time running labels and putting numbers on bags and trying to make sure that artifacts and their context can be associated later. Recording the find in situ, that is, say, right where you found it, is critical. So that's why we get very anal attentive about not picking up artifacts in the field before we've drawn and photographed them, taken measurements, so we can prove exactly where they came from. So looting kills context information. And it's a sad thing that in many parts of the world, looting is very widespread. And it's done usually by poor farmers who have few other options but to destroy their own culture's past. And the people making money on that are further up the food chain, and many of them are right here in New York City, where unfortunately illegal antiquities are freely bought and sold. So we have some problems then about the past and understanding it that has to do with context. You have to know where things come from. The other thing that's big in early archaeology is looking at the artifacts themselves and trying to make some sense out of the variation and the changes in the artifacts through time. Here's a big pile of flint daggers from Sweden, and below that you can see there's a classification system from 1 to 5. They are grouping daggers by how they're made, what their shape is like, and just sort them out along a typological line here. So artifacts are described, are classified, are sorted into types. You got a type 5 there, you got a type 1, you got a type 3. Seriation, you're placing in order. So you're pretty sure that your type 1 is earlier than your type 3, type 4, type 5. You can reinforce that seriation, and you should, by going out and digging them up and paying attention to context and superposition. Are type 1s always lower in the dirt than type 5s? What are they associated with? You know, are the type 5s associated with bits of bronze where the earlier ones aren't? So that's the kind of question you would ask. But this is the sort of thing that archaeologists spend a great deal of time doing and have for quite a long time. So this is one of the earliest parts of archaeology, is studying the artifacts and connecting them with context. So let's do a little bit of fun organization with some artifacts of the fairly recent past. What you're looking at here is something I suspect you've all seen. It's a ring pole. It's made of aluminum, and this is one of the early ones. They change through time, changing shape, changing form, being a little heavier, and then eventually, I think probably before almost anybody in this room was born, top stopped. And the more familiar can top with a little lever on top is what you see today and consume today. So there's some story here about changing technology. There's also some story about changing form and function and social activities. Okay, the original ring poles had some technological problems, as the connection between the ring and the can is really weak. So a lot of time you try to pop it open and you just wind up cutting yourself and have to get the beer can opener anyway. They strengthened that, and that might work much better. But you notice the later types, the type 2 we're looking at here in the middle, has not a rounded, but sort of much more oval ring pole. This is in part to make it easier to grasp, but really what it's all about is because municipalities around the country got very tired of people using ring poles and a little bit of filing to make them look like quarters to things like parking machines. So you have parking meters that wind up being full of these things instead of quarters, and people didn't think it was funny. So that's one of the reasons why these things change shape. And then, of course, ring poles stopped, because in part, they were hard to recycle. They never stayed together with the can, but also it meant that you had a lot of garbage. Garbage kind of sharp. Don't step in these things, they'll cut your foot. Widespread everywhere. If you go out in any park in New York City today and go over to the waste can where it's been for a long time and just scuff up the dirt a bit, I will bet you're going to find at least a few of these ring poles coming up. If you go to the beach, I'm sure you're going to see them coming weathering out of the sand in various places. So that was a big issue. And so there's some technological change. There's some social issues involved here. What you're looking at is a kind of an object that archaeologists love because it was common. They made tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these things were produced. Also, they made aluminum in most depositional environments. It's going to last forever. So these ring poles are going to be around thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years in the future. And because there's so many of them all over the place, boy, you can do all kinds of fun things with them in terms of dividing up the past. Let's look at how. Okay, here we have on the bottom some layers in the dirt to imagine that this is in New Jersey in the Meadowlands, and this is one of the great garbage hump heaps created by New York City in the 1960s to the 1980s. And this is about the period in which the ring poles were really popular. So in the bottom, you have the circular type ring poles. In the middle, you have the later type 2s, the oval ones, and then towards the top, the cans come in with the little levers on instead. Okay, so this allows you, by paying attention to the depth from the surface, to get a pretty good idea that the ring poles change through time, and the round ones are the first, the oval the second, and then eventually you have the third. So you have this temporal dimension of this changing percentage of these artifacts. Okay, let's go to another spot, and let's decide we're going to be in, say, Tucson, Arizona. And we've got another midden, it's not as thick, another garbage heap. And here's what we got initially. So on the bottom, we have the circular ring poles. And on top, right on top of them, you've got all of these lever cans. So the question is, what happened? I mean, one thing you can tell from this is that there was something connected up the people in Arizona with the people in New York in this time period. So even if you knew nothing else about America, you know that these two places were connected somehow in a fairly important way, same artifacts. And the other question you have is, from looking at this, what happened in Tucson? Was it a period of abandonment during the oval ring pole period, or what's the story here? Notice if we do this, the story changes. Now what you've got is ring poles in the right order, and it looks as though there really isn't a temporal gap. Instead, your story here might be that Tucson actually was founded after New York City and doesn't have the initial layers. It turns out not to be true. Tucson's actually was founded a few years before New Amsterdam, but I think you see the point of how this works. Let's move to a spatial distribution across the map. So here we have a really crude drawing of a coastal area with a river and mountains and some sites. And our sites wind up having ring poles in them. And in the early sites, we have just some circular ring poles, and then in some sites, we have a superposition of the later ring poles, and then it seems to spread. The oval type 2 ring poles, then, the sites that have them seem to spread down the river down to the sea coast. And then we have the phenomenon of the lever tops. So the lever tops start outside our valley, and then they come in and they replace many, but not all, of the ring pole sites. So we have a lot of stories we can tell from this one. It's very exciting. Is this a case of invasion? Are the poor ring pole people being invaded by the lever top can people coming from the outside who genocide them, take over their cities? It's just a terrible story. Or alternatively, is this a case where the ring pole people, for whatever reason, die out or move, and many thousands of years later, the can people come in, lever top? As we'll see, these kinds of stories, the kinds of things you can tell without any documents at all, just by looking at common artifacts like our pop tops and paying attention to where they come from, especially in vertical dimension. This gets us thinking a bit about stratigraphy and superposition. Superposition is a very important and really sort of simple, almost dumb principle. It goes like this: the old stuff's in the bottom and the new stuff's in the top. So if you pay attention to depth in space, you're actually also tracking time. So as you go down in this stratigraphic profile, you'll see you're going from a colonial era house someplace in North America, and there's all sorts of layers here. Down the bottom, it looks like the mammoth skull popping up down there. So all these things are arranged by time, but notice it's not quite that simple. In some cases, you have situations where animals, there's a burrow going there, or past humans have disturbed stratigraphy, disturbed the nice layers one on top of another, and made them reverse, with old stuff being taken above the newer stuff. So intrusions are something to watch out for. You have to be very aware. This guy, this burial down here, is not really contemporary with mammoth. He's actually coming down from above, as you can see. So he's from the later period. So you're asking this basic question, were humans and mammoths contemporary in the site? You can't prove it by that profile. So you have to really pay attention very closely to context and association, where things found with, and especially with intrusions. This is why archaeology is something you have to learn in the field. You cannot learn in a course like this at home, because it is complicated, and recording this kind of stratigraphy, observing it correctly, is complex, and it takes us all a while to learn how to do that. So one thing we're going to talk about today then is where this way of knowing comes from. As you can see, it's not very obvious. It is, in fact, difficult to understand the past using archaeology. We're never observing things directly, no time machine. It's all proxy evidence. It's, again, a bit hackneyed to say it's like a crime scene investigation, but it is in some respects. We want to know what happened, but we can't directly observe it. So we're using the material evidence, the relationship of objects to each other, in the ground and horizontally both, to figure out how we're going to divide up the past. So where did archaeology come from? Where did this strange way of knowing come about? And that is coming up for our next talk.